SPQR, four letters that still echo through history textbooks, statues, propaganda. But what if everything you thought you knew about Rome was a lie? What if SPQR wasn't a symbol of the people, but a political weapon used to enslave them? A mask worn by tyrants, a smokescreen for conquest, the original branding of control. Because Rome didn't fall because of war. Rome became an empire while pretending to be a republic, an SPQR. It wasn't about liberty, it was about obedience wrapped in Latin. This is not a history lesson. This is a warning told through the rise and fall echoing across the entire history of the Roman Empire. Welcome to Shadows of Ancient History, where today we tear through marble and myth to reveal the day democracy died and nobody noticed. The Roman Republic began not with a revolution, but with a story one of betrayal and kings. Tarquin the Proud, the last of Rome's monarchs, was cast out in a blaze of moral outrage after his son's infamous assault on a noblewoman named Lucretia. Her tragic suicide would become the origin myth of the Republic power seized not for ambition, but for justice. Or so the Senate claimed. But from the very beginning, cracks ran beneath the polished stone. The Senate, the Senatus, was not an elected assembly of the people. It was an elite club of aristocratic families, the patricians who had ruled even under the kings. They simply swapped a crown for a toga and called it freedom. The plebeians, the common citizens, had little say in this new order. They were offered tribunes, forums, and assemblies. But real power that remained locked in the cruel chairs of the patricians passed down like heirlooms. A strange moment came in 494 BCE when the plebeians staged a mass secession, leaving the city and camping on the Aventine Hill. The Senate panicked. With no workers, no soldiers, and no stability, they relented and created the office of the tribune of the plebs. It was a concession that looked like progress, but functioned more like pressure release. Historians still debate whether the Republic was ever truly democratic. What they do agree on is that power in Rome wore 1,000 masks. Beneath the language of liberty lay a quiet oligarchy, one skilled in theater and fluent in fear. The early Republic was built on a delicate balance, laws codified in the 12 Tables, military service as civic duty, and a shared Roman identity forged in endless wars against neighboring tribes. But even as Rome expanded, its political structure did not. Senators elected as consuls controlled both war and wealth. The spoils of conquest flowed not to the public, but to private estates. Victories brought parades, triumphs. Yet the burdens of war fell hardest on the farmers, who returned home to find their land sold, their families impoverished, and the rich bought these lands, stitched them into vast latifundia, and staffed them with slaves captured from distant battlefields. Meanwhile, displaced citizens flooded the city, jobless and angry. To keep them quiet, the Senate offered bread and spectacle, gladiator games, chariot races, cheap grain, and above it all, the symbol SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. It sounded noble, it looked eternal, but in truth it was a clever fusion of opposites. The Senate ancient and aristocratic, the people restless and many. The phrase implied unity but masked a widening divide. In 367 BCE, a strange compromise known as the Licinian Section Laws allowed plebeians to be elected as consuls, one of two top magistrates each year. On paper, it was equality. In practice, the patricians found workarounds, creating new offices like the praetor to retain power in subtle ways. Like a snake shedding its skin, Rome changed form while keeping its essence. The ruling class adjusted, adapted, and always emerged on top. But as the Republic stretched farther into Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, the contradictions grew harder to hide. Foreign wars demanded more soldiers. Soldiers needed land and reward. Yet the Senate's greed remained unchanged. It was in this tension between ideal and reality that the seeds of collapse were first planted. Roman virtues demanded sacrifice for the state. But what if the state no longer served the people? What happens when a republic forgets its own citizens? There was a curious event in 218 BCE during the Second Punic War. A Carthaginian general, Hannibal, crossed the Alps with elephants and shattered Roman legions at Cannae. In the panic, some senators proposed surrender, but others, led by Fabius Maximus, held the line not with force but with delay and attrition. Rome survived not because of strength but stubbornness. Its people endured. Yet when victory came, the wealth once again flowed upward, not outward. A pattern had begun, one that no reform could fully reverse. And though the Republic still held its rituals, elections, laws, debates, its soul was shifting, quietly, steadily, away from shared governance and towards something darker. Rome's foundation trembled, but the Senate remained unmoved. They wore tradition like armor and dismissed discontent as noise. But in the century following Hannibal's defeat, that noise sharpened into something more dangerous: rhetoric, rebellion, and revenge. The first tremor came in the form of two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Both were born into privilege. Both were deeply Roman. Yet what set them apart was their vision, not for conquest abroad, but for justice at home. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, saw what the Senate refused to: vast inequality, dispossessed veterans, and a swelling underclass that no amount of bread could pacify. He proposed a land reform bill that would limit the amount of public land a single person could hold, redistributing it to poor citizens. It was radical, it was popular, and it was blocked. When the Senate refused to fund his reforms, Tiberius turned directly to the people. He bypassed the Senate, a breach of tradition that rattled Rome's political foundations. The elite, fearing what they called mob rule, responded not with debate, but with blood. In a shocking act that shattered all previous norms, a group of senators and their followers beat Tiberius to death in the streets of Rome. His body was thrown into the Tiber. This was not just a murder, it was a message: reform had limits, and those limits were drawn in steel. Historians still debate whether Tiberius's approach was reckless or revolutionary. What no one disputes is the precedent his death set. Violence was now a tool of politics, and once opened, that door would never fully close. A decade later, Gaius Gracchus picked up his brother's cause. He was more eloquent, more strategic, and arguably more dangerous. His reforms went even further, offering subsidized grain, establishing colonies for the poor, and even challenging the Senate's judicial power. For a time, he succeeded. But as with his brother, popularity became perilous. The Senate, now accustomed to violence as politics waited for their moment. It came in 121 BCE during a dispute that spiraled into a riot. A Senatus Consultum, ultimum and ultimate decree, was issued. It gave the consuls emergency power to defend the Republic. Gaius was hunted, cornered, and rather than be captured, he ordered his slave to kill him. The blood of the Gracchi soaked into Rome's soil, and from that soil grew a new breed of politician, not statesmen, but demagogues. These new leaders learned a critical lesson: the people could be weaponized. Give them grain, promise them justice, stir their anger against the Senate, and they would cheer for you, vote for you, die for you. One of the earliest and strangest examples came in 100 BCE with Lucius Appuleius Saturninus, a populist tribune who introduced radical laws and used street gangs to enforce them. His reign of chaos only ended when the Senate, once again invoking the ultimate decree, killed him in a temple sanctuary. But the precedent had evolved. The mob wasn't just a threat, it was a political tool. Rome had entered a dangerous feedback loop. The more the Senate resisted change, the more politicians incited the masses. And the more chaotic the city became, the more the Senate clung to emergency powers. In time, a bitter irony emerged. The same republic that feared kings had grown addicted to strongmen, and they were about to get their strongest yet. In the background, a quiet shift was taking place. Rome's army was transforming. Once composed of citizen soldiers who fought for the Republic, it was slowly becoming a force of professional legions, loyal not to Rome, but to their generals. And the Senate, they watched, they debated, and they did nothing. While inside the city, the streets pulsed with unrest, bread lines grew longer, corruption flourished, and behind the marble steps of the Curia, whispers of conspiracy never ceased. One little-known event took place in 91 BCE. A tribune named Marcus Livius Drusus proposed extending Roman citizenship to the Italian allies, men who had fought and bled for Rome without the full rights of a Roman. He was assassinated. What followed was the social war and an uprising of Rome's Italian allies who demanded recognition. Rome won the war, but only by granting the very citizenship they had refused. It was another crack in the Republic's marble mask, because the more inclusive Rome tried to become, the more fragile its old power structures appeared. The illusion of unity SPQR was beginning to fray, and still the Senate clung to rituals, to robes, to marble symbolism, as if ceremony could substitute for legitimacy, as if titles could replace trust. But the people had tasted something new, voice. And they were no longer content with theater. They wanted results. They wanted champions. And they were willing to follow anyone who could promise them more than bread and games. It was a turning point, one of many in the entire history of the Roman Empire, where fear triumphed over reform. Out of the rising smoke of populist unrest came the sound of marching feet. They didn't march for the Senate, they marched for a man, Gaius Marius. A military genius, a novus homo new man, with no noble lineage, Marius shattered the expectations of Roman society. In 107 BCE, he reformed the army in a way that would echo through centuries. No longer would only landowners serve. Now the landless poor could enlist, and in return, they would receive pay loot and the promise of land. It sounded noble, but it rewrote the DNA of the Republic. Because these new soldiers no longer fought for Rome, they fought for Marius. And that changed everything. Historians still debate whether Marius's reforms were salvation or sabotage. He defeated foreign threats like Jugurtha in the invading Cimbri and Teutones, yes, but he also planted a silent fuse. His soldiers' loyalty lay not with the SPQR, but with their general's hand. And someone else noticed. Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Once an ally of Marius, Sulla rose through the ranks with sharp wit and sharper ambition. When conflict flared over who would lead Rome's forces against Mithridates in the east, Sulla did the unthinkable. In 88 BCE, he marched his legions, Roman legions, into the city of Rome itself. It was unprecedented in scale and symbolism. Never before had a Roman general so openly turned the army inward against the Republic's very heart. Unthinkable and irreversible. This was not a foreign enemy laying siege. This was a Roman general turning his army on his own government. The spell was broken. Rome had always believed that its military served the Republic. But now it was clear the Republic served whoever controlled the army. Sulla took control of the city, declared Marius an enemy, and exiled his political foes. Then bizarrely, he left for campaign. In his absence, Marius returned from exile like a ghost from the past, aged, bitter, and ruthless. With his own loyal troops, he reclaimed the city in a storm of vengeance. The streets of Rome ran red with proscriptions, official death lists sanctioned by the state. The Forum became a chilling theater of terror, where the heads of senators were displayed as warnings to those who opposed the new order. And when Marius died, Sulla returned to do the same. Revenge had become policy. Sulla's second occupation of Rome brought with it a new title, dictator. Not the old emergency post of 6 months, but a dictator with no term limit. He rewrote the constitution, neutered the tribunes, and packed the Senate with loyalists. Then strangely, he resigned. He simply walked away. But the damage was done. Rome had learned to tolerate the intolerable. The Republic, once guarded by invisible norms, had grown numb to lines being crossed. Marching on Rome, executing enemies, seizing absolute power, these were no longer outrages. They were options. A strange episode followed in 63 BCE when a failed nobleman named Catiline plotted to overthrow the Republic with a band of desperate debtors and mercenaries. His conspiracy was exposed by Cicero, then consul, who used emergency powers to have the conspirators executed without trial. It was controversial, illegal. Some called Cicero a savior. Others saw a new pattern, fear justifying the erosion of law. And into this arena stepped 3 men who would twist the Republic into something unrecognizable. Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the first triumvirate. It wasn't an official office, it wasn't even legal. It was a private pact between three ambitious men to dominate Roman politics. Crassus brought wealth, Pompey brought military prestige, and Caesar, young, brilliant, and popular, brought the people. Together they bypassed the Senate, passed controversial laws, and secured lucrative appointments. Caesar became governor of Gaul, and from there began his legendary conquests. While Rome watched its northern frontiers burn with the fires of war, Caesar was building something else: loyalty. His soldiers marched with him through forests, across rivers, into the unknown. He paid them, rewarded them, and spoke their names. He wasn't just a general, he was a myth in motion. And when Crassus died in a failed war against the Parthians and Pompey allied with the Senate to curb Caesar's rising power, the Republic stood on a knife's edge. It was a fragile peace, shattered by a single step. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, he violated sacred law. A general could not bring his army into Italy, but Caesar did it anyway. The Rubicon was not just a stream, it was the line between republic and dictatorship. The moment Caesar's foot touched the far bank, the Republic was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. The Senate fled, not debated, not defended, fled. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, many senators led by Pompey abandoned Rome without a fight. It wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. They believed they could regroup in Greece, raise legions, and crush Caesar as a traitor. But Caesar moved faster than politics. In just 60 days, he secured Italy, then Spain, then turned east to face Pompey in one of the most pivotal battles in Roman history, Pharsalus. It was August 48 BCE. Pompey had more men, better supply lines, and the Senate's blessing. Caesar had veterans. Pompey's cavalry, meant to break Caesar's flanks, was routed by an unexpected maneuver. Caesar had trained a hidden line of infantry to thrust upward at horse bellies. It worked. Pompey's formation collapsed. He fled to Egypt. There, in a strange and almost theatrical moment, he was assassinated by the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, who believed presenting Caesar with Pompey's head would earn favor. Instead, Caesar wept. Historians still debate whether his tears were genuine or political performance. But one thing was clear: Caesar was now unrivaled. He pursued reforms, canceled debts, expanded citizenship, reorganized the calendar, giving us the 365-day year and eventually the month of July. He wore the purple of power, though he refused the crown. Officially, Rome was still a republic, but the old rules no longer mattered. Offices were extended, laws were rewritten, and resistance was quietly crushed. Still, Caesar understood symbolism. He minted coins bearing his face aright, once reserved for one. He sat in a gilded chair at Senate meetings, and above him, the golden standard SPQR, the Senate and people of Rome. But what was left of the Senate, they met at Caesar's pleasure. The people still voted, but only for choices already made. And yet, for all his power, Caesar missed something vital. The Republic wasn't just law, it was theater. And in that theater, optics were everything. Rumors began to swirl that Caesar would name himself king, that Caesar would move the capital to Alexandria, a rumor perhaps deliberately spread by his enemies to stir fear of monarchy and foreign influence, that he would marry Cleopatra and create a Greco-Roman dynasty. On the Ides of February, during the Lupercalia festival, a strange event unfolded. Mark Antony offered Caesar a diadem, a symbol of monarchy. Twice Caesar refused it. The crowd roared, but many wondered, was it a test? A month later, on the Ides of March 15th, Caesar entered the theater of Pompey for a Senate meeting. He never left. A group of senators, calling themselves the Liberators, stabbed him 23 times beneath the statue of Pompey, his former rival. Et tu, Brute. The words may be legend, but the message was real. They believed they were saving the Republic. They believed the Republic still existed, but they were wrong. What followed wasn't rebirth, it was collapse. Civil war returned like a tide. Caesar's supporters, led by Mark Antony, and Caesar's adopted heir Octavian, clashed with the assassins. Cassius and Brutus, the leading conspirators, were driven east and met their fate at Philippi in 42 BCE. The irony, Caesar's death meant to preserve the Republic accelerated its end. Because Octavian was not just Caesar's heir in name, he was his heir in ambition. Young, calculated, unassuming. But beneath the calm exterior was a master of manipulation. He formed the second triumvirate with Antony and Lepidus. Together they executed prescriptions, public death lists that eliminated political enemies and confiscated their wealth. One name on that list was Cicero. Cicero, the voice of the Republic, was murdered. His head and hands were displayed in the Forum. The message was clear: the old order was not returning. The triumvirate eventually fractured. Antony aligned with Cleopatra in Egypt. Octavian, sensing opportunity, declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, a foreign queen, a threat to Roman values. It was a brilliant sleight of hand. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE sealed the outcome. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated. Their suicides marked the final chapter of resistance. Octavian returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. He performed an act of surrender, offering to relinquish his powers. The Senate, hollowed indebted and fully aware of the performance, begged him to stay, enshrining his dominance as reluctant ruler. And so he became Princeps, the first citizen. Not king, not emperor, just a humble servant of the state. In reality, he held absolute power. Rome would never be a republic again. But the symbols remained echoing throughout the entire history of the Roman Empire. The Senate still met, the people still voted, and SPQR still adorned every banner. It was the final trick of the Roman state. The Republic didn't fall. It was slowly rebranded. The streets of Rome were quiet. No riots, no protests, no thunderous declarations of tyranny. Because by the time Augustus Octavian Reborn stood at the helm of Roman power, the Republic had already become a memory dressed in marble. The year was 27 BCE. Augustus addressed the Senate with humility. He claimed to restore the Republic and offered to relinquish his extraordinary powers. It was, of course, a performance. The Senate, now filled with men who owed their positions to him, begged him to stay. They granted him imperium over the provinces, control over the military, and the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. It was not a crown, it was something far more cunning, the invention of divine modesty. Historians still debate whether Augustus was the first true emperor or simply the last republican. What they agree on is that his rule marked a transformation not through force, but through finesse. The Republic did not end in flames, it ended in applause. And that was his genius. He preserved the facade. Consuls still existed, elections were held, laws were passed in the Senate. But every decision traced back to one man. It was no longer Senatus Populusque Romanus. It was Augustus and everyone else. One strange event during this era reveals the subtlety of control: the closing of the Temple of Janus. Traditionally, its doors were open during war and closed during peace. Under Augustus, they were closed, an event nearly unheard of during the Republic, symbolizing that Rome, long perpetually at war, now rested under imperial peace. But this peace came at the cost of freedom. Bread was still distributed, spectacles still dazzled. The people still chanted SPQR, but few remembered what it meant anymore. It was ritual without substance, a ghost in bronze. The army, once a citizen's duty, was now a professional machine loyal to the emperor. Veterans were settled in colonies across the empire, grateful, loyal and distant from Roman politics. The Senate remained, but it was theater, each debate a carefully managed echo of power long lost. A century earlier, Rome feared kings. Now it worshipped emperors as gods. And when Augustus died in 14 CE, his adopted son Tiberius assumed power. No election, no resistance. Just smooth succession. That was the moment the illusion cracked. Because power, once believed to come from the people, now moved by inheritance. And SPQR, it became a stamp. A decorative flourish on standards and statues meant to conjure the dignity of a republic that no longer breathed. One scholar called it the slowest death in history. Another said, the Republic didn't collapse, it decayed. It's a chilling thought. Because it didn't take one man to destroy Rome's Republic. It took millions of small silences. Each law bent just a little, each tradition eroded softly, each citizen who said, "It's not my fight." And over time, the people of Rome stopped asking questions. They accepted peace over liberty, security over voice, bread over principle. It was not an empire imposed on them. It was one they allowed to rise. And though the emperors who followed Caligula, Nero, Domitian would bring madness and murder, the Republic never returned. It had been replaced, not by tyranny, but by comfort. So this is how a republic dies, not with a tyrant kicking down the doors, but with the quiet closing of them. Not in battle, but in ballots no longer counted. Not in rage, but in relief when a people exhausted by chaos welcomed control dressed as order. SPQR still stood, etched on monuments, sewn into banners, whispered in ceremonies. But the meaning was hollowed out like the Senate chambers themselves. The Senatus Populusque Romanus. The Senate and people of Rome had once been a living promise, a contract between ruler and ruled. Now it was merely a memory written in stone, repeated by men who no longer believed it. And yet, that's the danger of symbols. They endure longer than truths. Long after the Republic had fallen, Rome's emperors kept the acronym alive. Not because they feared the people, but because they understood the performance. They knew that so long as the illusion of liberty lingered, real control would be easier to hold. Look closely at history, and you'll see this pattern again and again. Symbols stay, people change. And when enough people forget what those symbols were meant to defend, they become tools not of freedom, but of power. So the next time you see those four letters SPQR, remember what they truly represent. Not glory, not empire, but a warning of how easy it is to let freedom slip through your fingers while still believing you are holding it, and how even the sharpest republic can be dulled into obedience, not by swords, but by silence. Shadows fall long over marble, but never all at once. The day SPQR died was the day Rome stopped asking why.